Okay, welcome to lesson one on ecosystems. So we're going to have a look at all living things. All living things are important, even plants, because they all interact with one another. We're a bit self-obsessed as humans. We think we're the most important living thing on this planet. And to a certain extent we are, but you know, if you ask yourself the question, what would happen to life on this planet if humans were to disappear? Well, life on this planet would probably thrive, wouldn't it? Because of the impact that we have on other living things. So we're going to have a look at, that's what we're going to be studying, the importance of all living things on Earth. So this lesson particularly is basically learning some key terms. And then the next couple of lessons we'll start to look at how living things interact with one another. So these are the key terms that you need to know, listed at the bottom. By the end of this lesson, you'll know the definitions of these terms, but more importantly, keep learning them, keep going over them again and again and again, because you need to be able to remember these terms in a year's time as well. So the first word, biodiversity. Now, sometimes in science, you get words that are big, large, and difficult to understand. And sometimes if you break the word down into its constituent parts, then it helps you to understand what the word means. So if you break down bio and diversity, you might start having a bit of an idea about what biodiversity is. So you are studying biology. Biology is the study of living things. So bio basically means living. And diversity, well, that's to do with variation, differences. So that links in nicely. If you put those two things together, differences, variation, and living, then it comes nicely in terms of the definition. The total variety, which links in with the diversity, of living, which links in with the bio, things on Earth. So that's the definition of biodiversity, the total variety of living things on Earth. The next key term is species. Now, how would you define what a species is? Now, quite often when people are trying to describe what a species is, they start thinking that it's to do with how similar organisms look to one another. And quite often, if they're of the same species, they will look similar. That makes sense. But how can you tell if an organism is of the same species? Because these two here, they look alike. They've got four legs. They've got a couple of ears, couple of eyes, tail. You could look at them if you were an alien from outer space and you just landed on this planet and you landed in that field and those two living things were in that field, you could easily think that they were of the same species. And then if you think about dogs that are of the same species, well, you can have a real variety, can't you, of different dogs in terms of how they look. So what is? So if you look at these two, again, they look similar. How can we decide whether they're of the same species? Well, let me tell you a love story. Once upon a time, Bob and Sharon, their eyes met across a field, and Bob trotted up to Sharon and he invited Sharon on a date. It was a romantic date. There was hay, there was wine. One thing led to another, and Bob and Sharon ended up having Darren. So Bob is a male donkey, Sharon is a female horse, and Darren is a mule. So Bob, or the donkey, was able to reproduce with the horse and produce Darren a mule. Now, if you know anything about mules, they're hybrids, and they are what we say they're infertile. In other words, they cannot have offspring themselves. So Darren, it's a sad story, Darren is not going to have any little Darrens. So this is how we can tell whether organisms are of the same species or not. Because Bob and Sharon can't produce fertile offspring, we classify them not as the same species. So you are of the same species if organisms are classed as the same species if they can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Now, if you were walking down the high street in Broxburn and you were to come across a lion, you would probably say to yourself, hang on a minute, that's slightly unusual. Don't normally get lions prowling down the high street. And that's because you understand that Broxburn is not a normal place for a lion to be. Lions would normally be found in the savannah, and so it would be, well, more than unusual to see a lion just walking down the street in Broxburn. Now, that's because living things have particular places where they live, and that is known as its habitat. Now, if I was to ask you what the population was of Scotland, you would tell me, well, you might be able to tell me, it's about 5.5 million. Now, the population of Scotland, when I ask you that question, you're automatically thinking of human beings that live in Scotland. So you wouldn't start counting the number of people that lived in London. You would just count the number of people that lived in Scotland in that particular area. And you wouldn't start counting the number of rabbits or the number of foxes, or you wouldn't add that into the population of Scotland, would you? You would just focus in on the number of human beings in Scotland. And that's what a population is. A population is the number of a particular species in an area. Now, when we talk about the word community in biology, it's slightly different than perhaps how we use the word community in everyday language. So if we were talking about the community of Broxburn or Livingston, you would generally talk about the people that lived in that area. But what we're talking about here is every living thing that is in that particular area is part of the community. So if the Broxburn community actually, not just people, but all the animals that exist and even plants are part of the community of Broxburn. An ecosystem is made up of all the living and non-living things in a particular area. So how is that different to a community? We've just mentioned community, haven't we? Well, a community is all the living things, but an ecosystem is all the living things and the non-living things. So if you're looking at this picture here of a particular ecosystem, yes, you've got living things. You've got a kangaroo. That's a bit of a strange one. But you've got a kangaroo, you've got plankton, you've got bacteria, you've got algae, you've got a tree, all alive. But you've also got water, sunlight, rocks, things that are not alive, but they will still be part of the ecosystem. So let's play a little game. I'm going to show you some ecosystems, and I want you to read my mind. See if you can guess which abiotic factor I am thinking of when we look at these ecosystems. So abiotic means non-living. So a non-living factor in these next three pictures. I was thinking seawater. High temperatures, possibly sand. I was going high temperatures. Ice, a lot of water in the form of ice. So there are living and non-living things as part of an ecosystem. So two more terms you need to understand is a food chain and a food web. So let's start with a food chain first, because that's the simplest, the one on the left. So a food chain really shows you how organisms interact with each other. So this is really showing how organisms get their energy. So the vole will eat grass seed, and the arrow going into the vole shows that the energy is going into the vole by eating the grass seed. The barn owl eating the vole will get energy by eating the vole, and so that's what the arrow in the food chain represents. The arrow in the food chain does not show what eats what. It does not show what eats what. It shows the direction of energy flow. Looking at the food chain as well, we can explain what a predator and prey means. So the barn owl would be classed as the predator. It is the hunter. It is hunting the vole. And the vole would be classed as the prey because it is being hunted. Now, in reality, in an ecosystem, there are lots of interactions that take place between different living things. It's not just as simple as a food chain where you have one thing affecting one thing affecting one thing. Animals eat lots of different things, and that can be displayed in a diagram called a food web. And a food web is basically made up of a number of different food chains. So if we look through this food web, we can probably get a number of different food chains out of it. So if we start with the oak tree, we could then go to the squirrel, and then we could go to the fox. Or we could do an oak tree, a caterpillar, a shrew, an owl. Or we could do an oak tree, the leaf litter, the earthworm, the wood mouse, the owl. So each of those would be classed as a food chain, and then combined, we make a food web. A much more realistic idea of what's happening out in the ecosystem. So I'm just going to use this food web, and I'm going to give you some keywords and some definitions. You try and identify an organism within this food web that connects or links to the keyword that I'm describing. So the first word is a producer. So a producer is a living thing that can make its own food, and it usually, well, no, it doesn't usually. It always uses energy from an abiotic source, a non-living source, in order to make its food. The oak tree is the producer. Usually a green plant is the producer within a food web. There are also consumers within the food web. So consumers get their food from a biotic source by eating the biomass, by eating the thing. And the majority of things within this food web are consumers. If it's not a producer, it's a consumer. There are different types of consumers. There are herbivores, there are carnivores, and there are omnivores. So a herbivore is something that just eats plants. So according to this food web, a squirrel would be a herbivore because it's just getting its energy from the oak tree. A carnivore is an organism that just eats other animals. So for example, the owl would be classed as a carnivore. And I don't think there's an example of an omnivore in this food web, but an omnivore would be something that eats plants, but also eats animals as well. This final definition, this final word is a bit of a strange one. So it's a niche, and it's the role that an organism plays within its community. Now, to try and explain that a little bit, we all play different roles with different people in life. You know, so the role I play with you lot is I am a teacher. That's all you think of me as. To the people that I work with, I'm, you know, a colleague, and for a couple of them, a friend. When I go home, I'm a dad. I've got friends, believe it or not. So when I go down the pub, you know, when I catch up with my friends, that's what they think of me of. They don't think of me of me as a teacher. I'm just their pal. So depending on the situation and who it is that I'm interacting with, I take on different roles, and different people get different things from me in life. And it's similar with living things within a community. They can play different roles within the community and give things to other living things that other living things require. It just gives you a list of some examples there of things that should be considered when you're talking about the niche of an organism. So the resources that are required by that living thing, whether that be food or space, interactions with other organisms, which is the example that I talked about, how they interact with other organisms, competition, we'll talk a bit more about that later on, predation, you know, are they a hunter, are they hunted, are they both, and also conditions, environmental conditions that they're able to cope with or tolerate. So that's a lot of new words. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a few slides. Just pause the video as you go through and then check your answers at the end of the video. Okay, so here are the answers. Which of the following is the best definition of biodiversity? The total variety of species and variety within species on Earth. Habitat? No. The place where an organism lives. An ecosystem is the living and the non-living. A community is all the living things in an area. A population is the number of a particular species in an area. Two abiotic factors, within that list, pH and rainfall. Abiotic means non-living, biotic means living. And finally, which of the following is the definition of a niche? The role an organism plays within the community. Okay, so practice as much as you can these terms and drill them into your brain. Okay, speak to you later. Bye.